I'm glad to be here and initiate what I see as an initiation, or perhaps if folks are already familiar with this concept, a development or enhancement of the conversation on critical consciousness and pre-college engineering education. As engineering continues to create a space or stake out its space in pre-college education, I think there's some critical questions that we have to think about on how not to reproduce the same problems that we see at the collegiate level or in the or in industry and professional levels. And so this is a way I think to kind of enter or connect teachers and pre-college educators to those type of issues. Oops. So I'll be going through in the time we have one positionality. What that means is my approach, my expertise, my experiential knowledge that I bring to thinking about engineering education. This consciousness is a construct that I would like to talk to you all about. Some people are familiar, very few, but I don't think it's talked enough about in issues of equity, justice, and so on in any form of education, but particularly engineering education. And then, of course, the main topic, critical consciousness. What does that mean? What can it look like in engineering education? I do work in urban STEM education. And so even though I work with a lot of teachers, I think the researcher side of me tends to be very theoretical and talk about theory. So if something I'm saying doesn't make sense, if you want to be more practical, feel free to share those comments in the chat, and I'll try to attend to those and adapt appropriately. So my research foci really about two things. One, studying systemic racism's reproduction of inequity in educational outcomes for Black engineering students. I particularly say systemic racism because I think a lot of conversation around racism and other isms is at an interpersonal level. And I think we need to focus more on the ways in which systems have been developed so that it doesn't require individuals to act in mean or inappropriate ways. Like they're already embedded in how we operate. And so if we don't disrupt, deconstruct, and transform those systems, then they are perpetuated and sustained. Secondarily, when I say inequity, there's a particular distinction between that and inequality. I think a lot of times we talk about inequality and people not having the same thing, but we don't talk enough about how to repair and support those who have been disadvantaged historically and continue to be disadvantaged. And then also you can see I focus on Black students, right? Secondarily, I look at pedagogical practices of science and math educators to deepen understand the relationship between culture and cognition. So how can we leverage who we are, who people are, their cultural norms of interacting to deepen the ways in which they grasp content. And so this idea that I kind of push of pro-Black STEM education is really a response to anti-Black STEM education, where it's not just about trying to separate ourselves from negative and problematic practices, but we also need to develop a tool set of affirming practices. How do we affirm Black students' identity, their epistemology, or ways of knowing and doing? And so that's what pro-Black STEM education is. But today, I'll primarily focus on this part, this the reproduction of inequity due to systemic racism. So one overarching guiding question for my work is looking at this representation of Black people in engineering. This number of 4.3% fluctuates not by much. It goes up 1%, goes down 1% or tenths of a percent every few years, but it doesn't really move much. And often the reasons why it's so low have been Black people aren't motivated, Black people aren't adequately prepared in science and mathematics, low socioeconomic status, all these reasons that tend to focus on the Black student and their family and their resources, not looking at those who have failed them. And so I look at the question of to what extent is our social political context, those other factors, ecological, social, economic, that inform how we live life and how we operate in society, how did that influence the way the minimal presence of Black students in engineering? So that's just a little bit about me. Now, moving on today specifically, this idea of this consciousness was presented by Dr. Joyce E. King. She's an urban education scholar that I have great respect and adoration for. And here's one of her books. She talks a lot about disconscious racism. Other scholars have expanded this idea of disconsciousness to ableism, so disconscious ableism. I've even written co-authored a paper around critical disability theory or discrit, being used to examine how disconscious racism and ableism, disconscious ableism work together or co-constructed. And so it's applicable across different isms and forms of oppression. But particularly, I want to look at the broader concept, just spend a little bit of time introducing this concept. And so what she says is this consciousness is an uncritical habit of mind. So if we think about habits of mind, some of us may be familiar with engineering habits of mind. There's ways that we think without having to think about it, right? They're just ways that are normal to us. It doesn't mean they're unconscious. They're just ways that we've been trained to think about certain things. And so that includes our perceptions, our attitudes, assumptions, and beliefs. So this consciousness is uncritical, and it justifies inequity and exploitation by accepting the existing order of things as given. Um, so I want to kind of slow down there and let people think about that, sit with that. Feel free to share in the chat how does it make you feel, what comes to mind, because a lot of times when we're talking about difference and discrimination, folks like to refer to implicit or unconscious bias. And what I believe and what Dr. King challenges is this idea of unconsciousness really removes responsibility. It presents as if it's not our fault, right? This is just a natural thing. Everyone has bias. But what we see is there's a very stark demarcation of inequity along lines of race, class, gender, and so on. So if it's a problem with everybody, and if it's so unconscious, why does it continue to show up in the similar ways, like the same ways? Particularly if we're talking about, again, in my case, the discrimination and oppression of Black students. And so this concept moves from this irresponsible or no one is culpable type of thing to say, actually, there's a way in which we've been socialized in this country that allows us to think things as they are okay. It's not the systems, it's not the way that things are working. It's more so individuals and people who are the problem rather than our social arrangement. And so also what it says is not the absence, kind of what I was just saying, right? It's not the absence of consciousness, but it's impaired consciousness or distorted way of thinking. And in her research, she's studying her scholarship. She works with pre-service teachers. And what she noticed is they found these ways, the way in which they thought, they justify these problematic constructs of interacting with students and how they taught students. And I think if you have a unconsciousness, then you can't really justify it, right? Because you're not thinking, it wasn't there. But when you find reasons to validate and legitimize problematic aspects of society, that's a different aspect of consciousness. And that's why it's impaired. And it's not really to blame people and say, you're a problem, you're a bad person, but it's more so to really bring notice to how deeply embedded these problematic ways of thinking are in our society. So you may say, okay, that's all, that's something to think about, but what does that have to do with engineering education, particularly in the pre-college space? And so some of the big ideas that show up in engineering broadly, but in particular in K-12, is these three right here: meritocracy, objectivity, and depoliticization. Depoliticization. Each of these tend to define how we think about knowledge development. What is knowledge? What is true? What is right? Not only in engineering, but broadly STEM fields. But of course, we're talking about engineering here. And so I won't go too in depth with these. Provided two resources. I will share my slides, but there are two papers at the bottom by Professor Erin Seck, who is at University of Michigan. She's actually a sociologist, but she studies social dynamics in engineering, right? And so sometimes it takes somebody outside our discipline to analyze things more authentically. But briefly, meritocracy is the idea of esteeming merit, right? Like just working hard, and the best ideas is what we'll take. We're going to reward those who present the best ideas. That's what most people tend to think about it, but it's actually deeper than that. It also includes this idea that those who produce the best ideas are the most capable, right? So it's kind of this natural system where it's not about who you are, what you do, where you came from. If you have good ideas, those things will be honored and you will then rise to the top. What it does not consider is, again, social arrangement, social inequity. So the history, and I'll be specific here, of Black people who spent 265 years enslaved, when they were released, they were at a severe disadvantage, you can imagine, right? And so when we're talking about best ideas, how do they have the resources? Did they ever get the resources to then compete at a certain level? But also it's about even is it about how do we define best? Is it what's functional for a particular group or context, or is it about this ultimate, again, objective best? So now when we go to objectivity, it's this idea that even though we're all human, we all have flaws, somehow certain people get to determine what is the most true. Again, which does not is not based on our subjectivities or our gender, our experience according to our gender, our age, our region, race, and things like that. And so what it does is try to simplify how we interact when humans are very complex people. And again, if we study inequity, if we look at inequity, then we see how those things show up in the discipline of engineering. And then thirdly, depoliticization is to ignore social power, social dynamics of social power that play out in society. And so then the symptoms of these things are things like privileging math and science. So often, if we want to, in the pre-college space, if we want to kind of gauge who can be an engineer or who's more likely to be successful in engineering, we look for students who do well in math and science courses. We don't look in the arts courses. We don't look in social studies. You look to math and science, and then those are students that do well that we encourage to go further. Test as a central measure of intelligence, particularly standardized tests. So the SAT, ACT, again, in the pre-college space, even in the classroom, when we offer traditional exams, multiple choice, timed exams, that's how we figure out who we believe are the best prepared to be engineers, rather than looking at more holistic or diverse ways of representation of knowledge and understanding. It's about what can you do on this traditional exam. And then another example is elevating advanced placement. So it's not enough to even just do well on a test, but you have to go to this elite or separate place. And then those people, because they're being the most challenged, their educational experience is most rigorous, those are the best prepared. And we ignore or often, I shouldn't say we because I don't, but often what is ignored is the social construction of who gets access to certain courses or what schools have the resources to provide quality experiences. And so now moving on to critical consciousness, which is the opposite of this consciousness, is when you have more intentionality. This concept is taken up from Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I strongly encourage everyone to read and read again. It's very complex. But here, this quote is taken from the source at the bottom, where they simplify critical consciousness to mean the ability to recognize oppressive social forces shaping society and to take action against them. Right. So there's two critical pieces here. First is recognizing oppressive social forces. When you have that awareness, that consciousness, right? That's when you begin to work against this consciousness. That's when it becomes critical, because it's not just knowing how society works, but again, oppressive social forces. So we're not talking about things that are mean or disruptive or unhealthy, but really oppress people. But then the second piece is to take action against them, those social forces. So just knowing about them and talking negatively or trying to say I'm not contributing to them, that's not enough. To be critically conscious, you have to actively work against them. So some other scholars kind of broke this down into three different areas. And so the first aspect of conceptualizing critical consciousness, they say, is social analysis, which makes sense. We have to be aware of those social forces. This is the ability to name and analyze social, political, and economic forces that contribute to inequality or inequity and inequality. So again, equality or inequality is about people being at the same level, where equity is about how do we, when recognizing that there is disparities, how do we help folks who are disadvantaged or set back to get what they need to be successful? So social analysis is, again, developing some social awareness of how our political, economic, and social institutions work. Once we have that, then you can develop political agency. And that is having a belief that one has a capacity to affect social and political change, right? So again, that second piece of acting on it, you have to believe and be affirmed and optimistic that you can actually do something about this, right? So the belief that if you want to make change, you can. That's very critical. And then thirdly, then the social action. So what then do you do, right? What action is actually taken? And so there's a wide range of activities, and I'll share a few. But it's important to say that it's not just about doing something, but in particular, individuals engage in activities that challenge oppressive forces. So we have a lot of folks who are aware of inequity, and they're like, well, I just want to do better, right? Or I don't want to engage that. I'm going to do something new over here. And that's not what this is about. This is about actually engaging those oppressive structures to counteract them, as well as um, uh, mitigate and eradicate them. And so these are some ways, again, connecting it to engineering education. These are some ways in which we can work on that. So first, determining new aspirations for pre-college engineering education. And I'll explain these a little bit further in the next slide. Next, teaching engineering with interdisciplinarity, considering the centrality of race, class, gender, ability, and other aspects of our identity within our work, and then prioritizing the perspectives of the oppressed. So determining new aspirations, a lot of times engineering, or the reason why engineering, not the reason, but one of the major reasons why engineering has been encouraged to outreach and move down to the pre-college level is because people want to increase the quality and quantity of engineers, right? So now we can be more competitive on a global scale in technology as well as militaristic dominance. And so I think we need to shift into developing more educational goals rather than supporting more imperialistic norms of the society, right? That's one way to counteract, redress, work against traditional values, which perpetuate the same norms that we have. Secondarily, moving beyond diversity and inclusion. That may sound crazy, it may sound counterproductive, but what I mean here is going beyond just seeing a Black person in the room or in the front of the classroom, going beyond having a Black leader. So it's just about visual representation a lot of times, right? And diversity, I think we have turned, we say diversity, but a lot of people mean racial diversity in particular. So if you have a group of white people, they're very diverse because diversity is simply just difference. And so we are trying to get different people into place, but we're not appreciating different ways of thinking and doing, different cultural values. And so that's why we have to move towards justice, where it's not just about how can the different folks or people who have been excluded exist in the current structures, but how can we again resist and change those oppressive structures? So it's a much higher call. Secondarily, teaching engineering with interdisciplinarity. So building up the social aspects of engineering. A lot of times since engineering curricula at the collegiate level, and now I've seen this being replicated at the K-12 level, is heavily math-based. It's heavily technocentric, so we only focus on the technology and technological objectives, and we don't focus on what type of people are we developing. What are the spiritual aspects of knowledge and technology that we embed in how we design and how we create? Those things are inherent, but we haven't been given enough consideration. And then also with that is problem solving within authentic socio-political context. So not just developing chairs or schools without awareness, and just where we focus on the efficiency and optimization, but we don't consider, well, how will this item that we create impact the folks where it is located? What values do they have? What interactions is what's important to them? And then we talk about considering centrality of race, class, gender, and ability. These things is not just about mattering or that they're important, but it's also like, again, realizing how much they shape all that what we do, the words that we use, how we approach people, how we interact, but in particular as it relates to engineering, how we teach and what we teach. So often great inventors and great innovations in engineering knowledge, the people that that the field tends to elevate are white men, historically and even current like now. So now we're seeing more push for diverse representations, but the representations are changing, but again, not necessarily the epistemological or knowledge contributions, right? Other ways that people think about development and use problem solving, things like being egocentric, which means you're focusing on the person or human beings at the center of society, as opposed to being ecocentric, where we're thinking about how nature and animals need to be valued in our, or the harm that we can do to nature and animals, right? So a broader value system. And then lastly, or on this point, the hidden curriculum is, in short, I encourage you all to look this up if you don't know, but it's the idea of what we don't say explicitly, but the ideas that people pick up or students pick up in our knowledge or in our classroom or educational settings. And so this may include, if I go in the classroom in a traditional or common, I should say, pre-college STEM or educational space, most teachers are 80%. I think 80% of the teaching force are white women. So what is unsaid there, it is very difficult, or uh, it's not necessarily supported for other people to be teachers, right? Or it's a very female dominated field. So what does that mean for men to get into the field, or just various things like that? You don't have to explicitly say something, but students pick up on the lesson. And then lastly, privileging the perspectives of the oppressed means that those who are on the outskirts of are marginalized in society, they've had to navigate a different uh, complex arrangement of or I would say social arrangements to succeed. When we see, underrepresentation is not simply about a low number of people being present. It's the fact that they're easy to be overlooked and ignored and neglected, their interests. And so the fact that they've had to navigate that and still produce success means that they have alternative ways that we can grow from, that we can use to see things differently, right? But also what this does is privileging, this censoring of those perspectives shifts power dynamics. So it's not just about who's most dominant in terms of social power. It's not just about who's most dominant in terms of numerical arrangements, but it's about you. I know historically you've been pushed at disadvantages, so now I'm going to prioritize the needs that you have. And other folks are just going to have to be okay with that, right? Because that is really going to be helpful to everyone. So these are some ways that I have, or some examples of scholarship I've written about these things in practice. I think we have some time left. I want to leave it up for open questions, but I also want to end here with ASEE's year on impact and racial equity. There's various opportunities for you to get involved, but I appreciate you all's attention and engagement with me today.
Thank you very much. If we were in a room, I'm sure you would hear some rounds of applause. So I'm sorry that you can't hear that, but thank you. We really appreciate the time and effort and the that you put into presenting this to us today. And if we have questions, we do have some time for questions.
I do see some. Should I go ahead and answer the one in the chat? Yeah, okay, so Katie asks, how does this consciousness overlap with unconscious incompetence? We don't know what we don't know. Or is it maybe on another axis? And so I think that the implied goal of this consciousness is to develop that consciousness, right? So no one is expecting folks to come in knowing whatever. Like, we all have had a journey. I know me, even being a Black man, just being Black doesn't mean I understand social arrangements. I had to, in my collegiate career, I started reading a lot more books. There's a great quote by Paulo Freire that says, we read the word to read the world. And so reading certain scholars like Kendall or others helps us rearrange our understandings of things. And so, as educators, that's the key to us learning, developing and making new arrangements, is learning more, going spaces to put ourselves in positions to get deepen our knowledge, but also being willing to fail. I think this unconsciousness or unconscious incompetence, we tend to elevate those because, again, it removes embarrassment, it removes culpability, and we don't have to apologize or rectify anything if I didn't do it intentionally. And with this consciousness said, we need to move away from focus on intention and all that other stuff to say, how can we be intentional about equipping ourselves with the knowledge to act better? Any other questions or comments?
I have a question. I didn't have time to type it, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's cool.
All right. So you talked about some of the social factors that kind of undermine bureaucracy. What you go into some of the specific work that has been done to try to combat some of those thought processes with some of the either Black educators that you work with?
Can you repeat that so I make sure I hear it clearly? You said one more time.
So you talked about for meritocracy how there are social influences and factors that can undermine what do we understand as being best practices and who comes up with these ideas. Can you talk about ways in which your work that you were doing kind of combats some of that?
Yeah, so the students that I've worked with, I've been in teacher education for about 2 years now, and so it's still theoretical and trying to train teachers on to even adapt this perspective, because many of them are like, I enjoy education, I want to help kids, and I want to do what I was taught to do. But scholars like Gloria Ladson-Billings, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who talks about culturally relevant pedagogy, nowadays, Dr. Bettina Love, who talks about abolitionist teaching. Like, these scholars are the ones that inform our work in trying to help teachers think about so when I say social arrangements, let me be specific. I'm in Detroit right now. That's where I grew up. Our public school system, there's a book called Dismantle, and that's a great descriptor of what has happened. The power arrangements in terms of defining, and some of it is local to Detroit, some of it is broader. So for example, the funding for public schools being determined by property taxes. That severely limits what urban schools can do, because there tend to be an overrepresentation of impoverished community families. And so what has been shown is poor communities overtax themselves to provide more money for school, despite the stereotypes that poor people don't care about school, and particularly Black people. But if you're overtaxing $1, you're going to get so much, as opposed to those who are undertaxing $10 million, right? Where in suburban communities, there's a lot more money to fund schools. And so you have that federal funding and the property tax funding on top of what people pull out of their pocket. So those type of arrangements mean, the type of teachers that you can hire and support, the type of resources, the autonomy on your curriculum, you lose a lot of power there. And so scholars like Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about reframing not only the content, but the way in which we produce or teach the content. If I know these dynamics are happening, then all of a sudden education as an equalizer is not realistic. It's actually the way that the education I have to provide, I have to be more intentional, so that I'm not just trying to equalize, but I'm trying to address equity. It needs to be I guess equitalizer is not really a fancy word. I don't know if there's a word, but it needs to address equity, right? As opposed to equal. We're not living in the same context. So I can't produce the same equal thing. Another one is Dr. Tina Love. Her work looks at the control norms or the social norms of schools as built in buildings. So like in urban schools, particularly where Black students are located, Black and brown students, there's a lot of control. They have to act a certain way. They have to walk through the halls a certain way. And she argues that it replicates how prisons are controlled. And so if a school in somewhere else, in a more wealthier community and wider community, students have more autonomy in the hallways, that informs how they act in the classroom as well. That informs how they think about knowledge and their ability to be imaginative and creative and all those things that we say we want students to do. Where Black and brown urban students, they're being very trained and suppressed on how they can express themselves, how they can think. That also informs their ability to demonstrate knowledge and to think creatively. And so those are some active ways that scholars are kind of looking at that. But with the students I work with, we're not there yet. We're still kind of conceptualizing. I know I'm almost out of time, but Megan asked about talking more about decentering the common priority of representation to focusing instead on creating systems and environments where marginalized and minoritized people feel valued and affirmed in engineering. I've been using this word affirmed a lot. I think a lot of work and some of the difficulty, like if we develop critical consciousness, sometimes the language and semantics wouldn't be as central. I think when folks were pushing for representation, we meant something that was more along the lines of equity. But again, the powers that be took that and said, what's the least minimal anti-oppressive way that we can do something like this? And so what they did is say, all right, we'll look for someone who physically looks different, but intellectually and their values are the same as the white people who are already in the room. And so we're reproducing the same systems because we have not critically developed a critical consciousness to say it's not just about different faces, but it's the culture that those faces we think they represent or they tend to represent. So we're always changing stuff. So censoring The minoritized and marginalized people says, I'm not going to play these other games about trying to bring you into what's already there. I'm going to say this thing is not working. Not only for you all, it's not working for white people either. It's severe. Dr. Ebony McGee has a book, Black, Brown, and Bruised, how racism in STEM has limited our innovation or something like that. It's about the ways that racism is bad for everybody. And that's why in my intro slide, I had two white girls looking in a microscope, because this is not just about the Black students, the brown students, the disabled students, or students with disabilities, or whoever else, the low income students. This is about everybody. And so when we center students who are ostracized, marginalized, and so on, it really shifts the social arrangement, because all of a sudden you didn't have to think about those people before. They're different and you see that as inferior. So it was easy to ignore them. And now all of a sudden we had to listen to them. We had to see them as thinkers, as intelligent. It really disrupts and radicalizes the educational experience. And you see even students who may not say those things, you can see the visceral reactions that they have, that they're uncomfortable, and because they're not used to it. People don't do that. And so that's more so what I'm advocating for.
Thank you so very much for the questions and the answers and just the insight.